Duty, honor, country dictate what you ought to be, what you can be, what you will be.
The destiny of man is not measured by material computations. When great forces are on the move in the world, we learn we're spirits, not animals.
Now, we are the masters of our fate.
Howdy, gents. Welcome back to another episode of the Wolf and Iron podcast. I'm your host, Mike Yarbrough, founder and curator of wolfandiron.com. And I'm so glad you're here, guys. This is a great episode. We're going to be talking about porn today. And this is always a challenging topic because, when we think about pornography, it's kind of made its transitions in society. When I was growing up, and I talk a little bit about this in the podcast, it was the taboo subject. You didn't talk about it. Some people who had access to it kind of kept it to themselves, and it was only through, secret conversations that you would find these things out. And then maybe somebody would share like one of their nudie mags with you or something along those lines. And it's really just taking a shift today in society where we're just inundated with it, just completely inundated with it. I mean, not just pornography, but just sexualized images to the extreme. But today we're going to be talking about porn, and we're going to be talking to Garrett Jonsson. He's one of the guys over at Fight the New Drug. I'm not sure if you guys know what Fight the New Drug is. You can find out more about them by going to fightthenewdrug.org. You can also head over to wolfandiron.com/fightthenewdrug. That'll take you over to the show notes for this episode. And there's a couple of resources that we mentioned in here as well that may help you guys kick this thing called porn. And what I really like about what Fight the New Drug has going on is that they really approach things from just an education standpoint. Hey, let's learn about what's actually happening in the brain when you're watching porn and why it's different than sex, and how the objectification of objects leads to the objectification of people, and really the erosion of society in a lot of ways, guys. And I think this is what's happening today in society. A lot of the negative things that we see is really coming from an undercurrent that nobody wants to talk about except these guys. People don't want to call out and say, porn's wrong. We need to stay away from it. We need to, excessively limit this thing, get it out of our lives. And guys don't talk to guys like that anymore, and we need to. Churches have a very different approach typically to the subject, and that's why I thought it would be great to bring somebody in that's just more of a science-based, just a research-based kind of approach to this. So great conversation with Garrett Jonsson. And look, guys, if you're just checking us out for the first time, maybe you're listening to the Wolf and Iron podcast for the first time, and you're wondering, what's this all about? What's this, manly kind of stuff that's happening here? Look, Wolf and Iron is for the guys that are heeding the high call on their lives. And so if you feel that high call, if you feel like you're called to something greater than the status quo, if you feel like you're called to be a better father and leader and husband and example setter for others, then you're in the right place. And if you want to be surrounded by other guys that are like-minded in that respect, well, check out our free Facebook group. You can do that by going to wolfandiron.com/thegroup. That'll slingshot you over to our Facebook group page. There'll be a few questions to answer there. Make sure you answer those questions. We don't let just anyone in. This is how we keep the caliber of men in that group high. Once again, that's wolfandiron.com/thegroup. And without further ado, here's Garrett Jonsson of Fight the New Drug. Mr. Garrett Jonsson, thank you so much for joining me today on the Wolf and Iron podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Mike.
Yeah, man. And so you're part of Fight the New Drug in some kind of way, and we'll talk about how that those connections were made there. I'm really excited to talk to you about this. It's an odd subject when we talk about pornography, because growing up, porn was the taboo thing that you weren't supposed to do, although some people did. Probably a lot of people had some involvement in it, usually through magazines or movies or something like that. But as a kid, it was hard to get your hands on any of that stuff. But in any case, it was the thing you're not supposed to do. And then around I'm 40 years old now, but around my 20s, I began to see a shift in the culture, especially in my late 20s, where it was almost like as the internet became more popular, it was kind of like, listen, everybody's watching this stuff. Everybody's a part of this thing. And the taboo thing, or the thing that you're not supposed to do, is call people out on it and say, this is actually not good for you. This is actually not a good thing. And we'll get into this a little bit as well, but one of the points I want to make sure we touch on down the road in this conversation is that some of the guys, as I've talked about having some conversation with Fight the New Drug and then with you, I mentioned this on Instagram and some other social media accounts. They said, no, porn's actually okay. My wife and I, we watch porn. This is part of our life, or, things like that. And so there really is a culture out there that there's certainly guys that want to quit. And then there's certainly people who don't really see a problem with it. And so at some point in this conversation, I want to address that. And that's kind of like the hook for the guys that are listening to this, that don't think there's any issue. We're going to get to it, guys. So
right.
Just stay tuned. But before we get too far down the road, tell me a little bit more about what your involvement is with Fighting the New Drug, how you kind of fit into what they're doing, and then maybe just about the organization itself.
Yeah, so we as an organization, we're excited to be on the podcast. You guys are doing great things with Wolf and Iron. And what we are is we're a nonprofit, a registered nonprofit here in our headquarters here in Salt Lake City, Utah, but we do presentations all around the world. Our mission statement is simply to educate individuals on the harmful effects of pornography using science, facts, and personal accounts. One of the misconceptions with our organization is that because of this topic, like you talked about, one of the common things when you talk about the pornography is the taboo, and a lot of people will talk about the morals and this and that. But with us, it's all science-based, it's all research, it's all facts and personal accounts. We have no affiliation with any religion. No affiliation with any government organization. And it's simply, we also, another misconception is that our goal is to shame people who do choose to look at pornography, and that couldn't be farther from the truth. It's actually our goal is to eliminate the shame and simply educate so that people can make an educated decision if they want to look at this stuff or not. Okay.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, particularly the last part there about not trying to shame people who do look and listen, watch it, whatever. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Continue on.
Oh, no, I was just going to answer the second part to your question was, what affiliation do I have, or what's my role at Fight the New Drug? And at Fight the New Drug, what I do is we're a small group, but we're about 11 strong or so. We have over 1 million followers on our social media platforms, and what my job is, what my role is to present. And so we go into junior highs, high schools, colleges, and other organizations throughout the world and give presentations to educate on the harmful effects of pornography and talking about how pornography affects the brain, your relationships, and the world and our society. So that's my role, is live presentations with that organization.
So, I mean, that's a really unique position to take, and a really unique job. How did you get involved in this? I mean, like, what drew you to what Fight the New Drug is doing?
It's actually a pretty cool experience. They say that like your challenges in life will become your strengths, and I believe that to be true oftentimes, where if you're having to fight for something, or if you're having to work through something, and if you're willing to work through it with patience and able to learn, then oftentimes that thing will become your strength. And with the way I got involved with Fight the New Drug is I used to look at a lot of pornography, and I happened to go, so I'm sure we'll dive more into it, but basically from the age of 9 to 29, I consumed pornography quite often. And as technology advanced and the increased consumption was there, and then I went through about 4 years of marriage without being honest with my wife and not telling her the truth. And then at one point in my life, I happened to hear a presentation by Fight the New Drug, and I had never heard of Fight the New Drug. I had never heard the science, and I just happened to sit down in this presentation, and what they were saying resonated with me, because I felt like, man, these guys are addressing kind of my challenge with science, facts, and personal accounts, and I felt some catharsis there, and I was like, man, I want to tell the truth, So I got the courage to finally tell the truth, and from there I did some projects to raise awareness, because to be honest, I felt so much gratitude towards them, towards Fight the New Drug, and so I wanted to build awareness and help them out and help other people who have a challenge with this stuff. And once those projects were finished, then I got the opportunity, the CEO reached out to me and said, hey, we want you to present your story and kind of be the presenter of your story. And so they created a little documentary or video of our experience. And then that's how I got started. So I've worked for Fight for about 2 years now and presented over 100 times in a lot of different states.
So I think you bring up a good part of your story that I think a lot of guys consider, but they don't necessarily want to go there. And that is the sort of coming out of the closet and saying, I've got a problem, and then telling their wife about it, and possibly friends who are going to hold them accountable, and, mentors and whoever else. And they most typically we just try to keep these things to ourselves and say, I'm just going to beat it on my own. Nobody ever has to find out that it was an issue, that kind of stuff. What was your wife's response when let me back up. What was going on in your mind first before you told your wife, and what was her response to that news?
So at that time, I thought that I had a full-on addiction because no one had ever talked to me about pornography. I had no education on it. I had no education on it, compulsive behaviors in general. And so in my mind, and there was so many times that I tried to quit, that I was like, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't like the way it makes me feel. Why am I doing this? Why? And I'd try to quit, and then I'd go back to it. And then there was times in my life where I was like, screw this, man. Like, I can't do it anymore. This is who I am. This is natural. It's natural for me to want to look at pornography. Yeah. And it's natural for me to look at pornography. And so I'd go back to it because I kind of basically given up. Like, I can't quit. So I might as well just kind of accept who I am. And so that's kind of where I was at. I had misinformation. I had no information. And then that feeling of being trapped in this reoccurring cycle. And so for me, when I talked before hearing about the science and the facts and kind of getting an understanding of the compulsive behavior, I just kind of felt hopeless about this aspect of my life. But I knew that I was a good person, Yeah. And so it was kind of challenging separating, because oftentimes when it comes to compulsive behavior, the difference between guilt and shame is not very it's hard to identify the difference between guilt and shame. And so I felt like I was a good person, but I did feel guilt. But there was times when I felt like I was a bad person because I was hiding this from my wife,
right,
and from other people. And so from there, once I actually got this education on compulsive behaviors and kind of started addressing it, I was worried about my wife, what her reaction would be, because it's like, you love your wife so much. In my case, I loved her so much and I care about her so much. So why would I tell her something that could possibly hurt her and break her heart? So it's like this vicious cycle. Do I keep it from her and hurt her heart that way behind the scenes? Or do I tell her the truth and be honest and hurt her heart that way? So it's like a lose-lose situation,
Exactly. Yeah. And so how did she take it though? I mean, what was her response, to that? I mean, was she oh my gosh, I'm so glad you became honest and everything was rosy? Was she heartbroken and it was just this rough road of regaining trust? I mean, what would that look like? I know it's different for every guy and different situation, but for your place, what was that like?
So I'd say my wife fell right in the middle of being, I think there would be some concerns there. If the wife said, no, it's okay, all is rosy. And then if there was the opposite side of that, like, we're done.
Yeah.
I think that both of those ends aren't ideal. And in my opinion, she kind of acted in an ideal way where she was pissed and she was heartbroken. And it did take time to kind of reconnect and build trust. But at the same time, she was like, hey, I want to work through it. And I think one thing that really made that possible, because I know there's some women out there who would be like, I'm done. But I think the fact that I was honest and came forward wanting to make a change and wanting to improve myself and kind of addressing that issue, that made her more willing to be like, hey, I'm on board. Like, let's work through this. Our family's worth it, kind of thing.
I think that's one of the good things about what Fight the New Drug is doing is that it arms you with information. It doesn't just say, hey, come clean and then stop, right? And so I think that puts you in a position, or any guy who's listening to this, puts them in a position to say, okay, I'm going to stop this thing, and here's how I'm going to do it. Here's what's really going on. I actually have a game plan of some kind to really address this thing.
Totally. And information, like you said, for me, one of the biggest points in being able to address this and feeling empowered to address this finally after 20 years of having this compulsive behavior is that information. Like you said, that the science and the facts and the personal accounts and that information did empower me to move forward. So I think you're right.
Yeah. You mentioned guilt and shame. I actually did a podcast episode on this a while back on shame, but I talk about the differences between guilt and shame, and the way I define them is this. Guilt is recognizing that you did a thing that was bad. Shame is recognizing that you're the kind of person that would do the thing in the first place. And I think that, when we can feel guilty about certain things, and we can feel ashamed about, certain things. And it's just that inward recognition that I would be the kind of person that would do the thing. And with addictive behavior, it kind of, with truly addictive behavior, it can kind of clouds the waters a little bit or muddies the water, because it's not necessarily all of you who's doing it, right? I mean, there's a part of you that doesn't want to do the thing, whatever it happens to be. Take another drink, quit cigarettes, whatever the case is, stop watching porn. Yeah. You don't want to do the thing, but then there's another part of you that's saying, yes, we've got to do this, and then, just give into it. It's that duality of mind. I am a Christian, and so I know you guys aren't necessarily affiliated with a Christian organization, but, my listeners know this, I'm a Christian. And so Paul talks a lot about the kind of the two sides of himself in the Bible. He talks about the part of himself that, basically doesn't want to sin, and then there's a part of himself that does want to sin. And I don't want to go off on a tangent of like, oh, porn is sin and it's wrong, and I don't want to go there. I want to stick to the science side of things, because I think that's really where you guys, you bring something really unique to the table. But anyhow, that's how I kind of identify guilt and shame. I don't know if that's helpful or not.
No, I think that is definitely helpful. And I think what I liked your definition of guilt versus shame. Another way to kind of identify that and identify the difference between the two is that guilt says that I did something bad, and shame says I am something bad, right?
Yep, good.
And when it comes to this topic, for a lot of people, it's like, and for myself at times, it was like, I'm a bad person. Like you're saying, whether you're Christian or whatever your religion is, I think that you can identify and relate to that two sides that you mentioned.
Yep.
How one side acts this way, our decision making is in one area, and then our desires and our true self is in another area.
Yeah.
And so I think that each of us, no matter what your religion or beliefs are there or lack thereof is like, you can definitely relate to that two-sided, I do want to do this, but I don't want to do this at the same time kind of thing.
So, I was just thinking here, before I go any further, some of the guys who are listening to this haven't heard my story related to porn. I mentioned it a little bit in a previous Ask a Man episode. So we do a podcast kind of series on occasion called Ask a Man. Guys will write in questions, and then we'll respond. Me and my pal will respond to those in a mostly humorous manner. But, we do a good job of kind of addressing. And one of the things we talked about was overcoming porn. And I've had a bit of a different experience, I think, than some guys have. So when I was a kid, I grew up in the 80s, and things were, there were things that were available on TV, Skinamax and HBO and all that kind of stuff. And I remember, even though we didn't have those things, we still had cable, and occasionally they would do the free things, for a week or two. They'd have free Cinemax or free HBO, and there'd be things that'd come on late at night, and I'd stay up late and watch all those. And, that'd be, soft porn, I guess. But there was typically access to magazines, and just even if it wasn't porn, it'd be inappropriate, things on TV. Right. And when I got to be in my 20s, the internet started to come out. I was actually in the Navy, and I had a big shift. I was married at the time. There still wasn't really like there is readily access available to porn. You had to really seek it out. Still, so this is about 98 or so. And I was on a ship with a bunch of other sailors, obviously, and they were just it's the stupidest thing. They were just starting to put internet on the ship, and I don't think it was filtered or anything. They didn't know how to do that. So obviously, the one guy on the boat that actually knows how to use the internet went straight for porn, And I remember walking into a room one day, and all these guys are gathered around and kind of like hooting and hollering, almost like you can imagine like back in World War II or whatever, when the guys would be looking at a calendar or some, good looking picture of some guy's girlfriend, whatever, a pinup. And these guys are all like just gathered around the computer, and I don't even remember seeing what they were watching, or anything like that. But I just remember seeing myself from the outside going, oh my gosh, that's what I look like when I'm watching porn. And I just remember thinking, I don't want to be like those guys. And some kind of a switch sort of flipped in my head, and it never did anything for me after that. And some of that has to do, I think, about a year ago now or so, I got diagnosed. I don't know if you want to call it diagnosed, but I got basically told that I have some form of Asperger's. And I've found that there are certain times in my life when I make a concrete decision, like something belongs in one category and not in the other category, that it's, it becomes very clear for me. And I don't really have a hard time struggling going back and forth. Like once I found out that like Cokes and soft drinks are bad, I just didn't drink them anymore. I know that's not how most people typically work, but I just want some guys to kind of understand, like I do have an experience there of seeing porn and being influenced by it and all that kind of stuff. I don't have the lingering experience of like it's just constantly in my life or it's an addictive behavior. So I don't relate to that. So that's why I'm really happy to have you here, somebody who can really kind of speak to these things. And I am really also interested to hear about like how does it affect the brain and the science behind it.
Well, I think it's pretty cool that you had that experience in the Navy. Like the fact that you walked in, those guys are gathered around, hooting and hollering, and then you had like that defining moment, like you said, and you said, that's what I look like. And for some, that's all it takes. But I think one thing to really kind of hit on with your experience is that self-awareness. Yeah. Right? Because one of the things that I've heard is if you want to quit, for example, if someone wants to quit smoking, then one way to do that is to not focus on quitting smoking, but to focus on increasing your awareness while you smoke. Yep. And you realize, like, well, why am I intaking this disgusting flavor? And why am I tainting my car and all this, my clothes? And why do I enjoy this? And once you increase that awareness, then you start to realize, like, man, I don't know if I like this, and you start to change. And it kind of seems like that's what happened with you. And you're like, man, that's what I look like. And then that's a cool experience. So props to you.
Yeah, and I've also heard one that really hit me hard afterwards was, somebody basically gave that, the example, you've probably heard it before, what would happen if you were to die in the middle of watching porn, right? You have a heart attack or something. Don't know what happens. You get struck dead. You die. Yeah. And, your family comes in there and sees you sitting, in front of your phone or in front of the computer, pants down or whatever kind of just awful situation. And you just think, oh my gosh, like, I don't want to be that guy. Like, I don't want to be that guy at any moment in my life. That kind of stuff I think it is that self-awareness, that sort of that outside view of like, man, I don't want to be that man.
Yeah, absolutely. But then a lot of us are willing to forsake that awareness for the short-term gain, right? For the short-term gain. But then it's like, why do we do that,
So I know the guys that are listening to this, they're thinking, okay, Mike, just cut to the chase, man. Like, how do I beat this thing? How do I quit porn? How do I get this out of my life? And so what's the process that you help people go through? I mean, do you just help them understand the science and then you give them tools, or like, what does that look like from the Fight the New Drugs perspectives? Like how do you guys help coach guys or whoever it is, guys and gals, through quitting porn?
So our organization is simply education on the harmful effects of pornography. We don't put too much focus on how to overcome it once you do have the challenge, but you have so many good resources out there. Okay. But one of the resources we provide, that we do provide, is called Join Fortify. It's the website. The URL is joinfortify.com. Okay. Now, this is it's not affiliated with Fight the New Drug in the sense that it's its own entity, but it's something that we push and utilize, and a lot of people who are with Fight the New Drug utilize the Fortify program. Yeah. And it's an online video-based program for not only pornography, but really all compulsive behaviors. And once again, the URL is joinfortify.com. And you can get mentors there, and you look at videos to increase your education on the harmful effects of pornography, and you'd like keep the daily battle tracker, kind of like similar to your AA programs, where you're going to have these coins as you go along to accomplish or to recognize you for your durations of abstinence, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So the Fortify program is a really cool program for that.
Okay, that's great. We'll make sure we'll throw the link out there in the show notes for this episode. So give us an idea of what's happening in the brain. You guys mentioned education here, and I've seen studies, I've read articles and stuff on how porn affects the brain, and it's different than actually sex with a loving partner. Give us some ideas, like what does that look like?
Yeah, so the good thing is, I mean, like you said, you hit it on the nose where you said it's different than sex, so it affects the brain in a different way. So sex is natural, and sex is good when it's with the right person at the right time in the right place, you know? What's different about it is when we talk about what's happening in the brain and how it's different. So there was a doctor named Dr. Valerie Boone, and she's one of the leading experts on all things addiction, and she's from Cambridge University in the UK. And one of the things that she's done is she's put people in the scanner as someone consumes pornography, whether that someone is a male or a female, doesn't matter the gender. And as they consume pornography, the part of the brain that lights up is not the part that deals with people, but the part that deals with with objects.
Yep.
And so when we talk about the difference between sex and sex is natural and sex is a good thing, then one of the conclusions that people jump to is, well, pornography is the consumption of sex through a digital form oftentimes, so that must be natural too because I'm watching a natural occurrence. And the reality is that you're not. You're triggering your brain to the part of your brain that deals with objects to engage. And if you think about what's happening in our society today, and recently within the last couple of years, we've seen a huge movement with like the Me Too movement.
Yeah.
And one of the things that goes along with that is objectification, right? And that when we objectify something, it's easier to act harm on them. And if you go back to Valerie Boone and her experience and what part of the brain lighting up is the part that deals with objects, well, there's correlation between increased consumption of pornography and increased objectification.
Wow. Yeah.
And it starts to make a lot of sense when you know which part of the brain is being lit up and activated.
So that kind of touches on a couple of things then. So at the beginning of this episode, you talked about how porn affects an individual, how it affects others, and how it ultimately affects society. And I think we begin to see those things coming together here. So when we begin to think about, let's say we watch porn, we objectify the women on screen in most cases. So we're speaking to guys here. We objectify the women on the screen. And you're saying that it then triggers us to begin to see people as more as objects outside of that viewing experience. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so, yep, that is what I'm saying. And the science and research is showing that those who consume pornography have a higher tendency to objectify those around them, including loved ones, which is kind of scary to think about. Yeah. Because one of the things that happens with pornography, and our mantra at Fight the New Drug is porn kills love. Yeah. And the reason why we didn't, so like if you look at a lot of other compulsive behaviors or compulsive substances, like with gambling, for example, or with alcohol, the mantra is to drink responsibly or to play responsibly, right? Yeah. But when it comes to pornography, our mantra is porn kills love. And the goal is one of the reasons why our mantra is not to watch responsibly is because there are studies and science is showing that it happens on a subconscious level. So your brain, your original state, everything that we consume affects our likes and our dislikes and our preferences. And so as we consume pornography, our original nature of how we originally treated this subject, it starts to get altered and affected, and all these things start to influence, the things we consume influence it. And then it gets to the point where it it's our original nature. So it's not our second nature. So pornography, as someone consumes pornography and walks down that road and starts to rewire their brain, then it's no longer a second nature. It becomes their original nature. It becomes their new nature. Wow. And it's a biological state. And so you start to, there's no wonder why there's increased objectification today and increased harassment and sexual assault and rape. And one of the correlations is increased consumption of pornography. And that happens, once again, on the subconscious level. So the goal, once again, is not watch responsibly. The goal is to stop the demand.
Yeah, that's really good. And that answers one of the big questions that I had, which is to those people who say, my wife and I, we watch porn, we use that in our marriage, it kind of spices things up. We don't have any issues with it. It's not killing our love. In fact, it's drawing us closer together. You guys would say, and the research would show that it doesn't matter. That's not a case. There is no responsible use of pornography because you cannot control the way your subconscious perceives what's happening on screen and the objectification of not only the people on the screen, but also the eventual objectification of, like you said, your loved ones and all the people around you.
Yeah. And so to the person that, because there are, like you said, a lot of people out there who are going to claim that they consume pornography. And when I say claim, maybe they are. They're consuming pornography with a loved one, with a significant other, and then that they're claiming that pornography is helping them connect and increase or spice up their sex life or whatever they say. Yeah. And even many doctors and psychologists are going to push for this as one of the things to try to experiment with. So there's a lot of push against, and there's a lot of people saying that there's no problem with it as long as it's consumed responsibly. Now, one of the other things you hit it on the nose when you said that you can't control how your brain is receiving that. So when you are consuming pornography, one of the reasons why people consume pornography is because of that instant gratification. And the reason why there's that instant gratification is because we have in our brain what's called the reward center. And that reward center has these neuroconnectors in it. And as we consume pornography, as the pornography enters through the eye, the brain is activated, the reward center is activated at an unhealthy level or an unnatural level. And chemicals like dopamine and serotonin and oxytocin and epinephrine start to flood the brain because of what's being consumed. Now, one of those chemicals is oxytocin. Yep. And one of the interesting things about oxytocin is that it's the bonding chemical. And so, like, if you shake someone's hand after a business deal, or if you give someone a hug, or as a woman delivers a baby and holds the baby for the first time, there is a shot of oxytocin in all those circumstances that is released that is a bonding chemical. And so one of the interesting things about this substance is that when someone consumes pornography, they are literally connecting with a pixel.
Yeah.
So you're starting to form a relationship with a pixel, with a digital device.
Yeah. Wow.
And so that's one thing that you would want to be concerned about. If you were a person who is in a situation where, hey, me and my wife watch it, one of the things, once again, you should be concerned about is that you're actually connecting with a pixel. And then the other thing that you want to be concerned about when we talk about stop the demand and how it affects, so that's how it affects the brain. But what about relationships and the world is the aspect that I did want to touch on real quick is the world. How is pornography affecting the world and our societies as a whole? And one thing that's really tough in today's world is that, so when we talk about sex trafficking, everyone is up in arms about sex trafficking, and with good reason, because it's a horrible act. Yep. And but then when it comes to pornography, maybe that same person is like, well, hey, pornography is okay, but sex trafficking is not okay. Right. And that's one of the things we really try to put some clarity on and shine some light on is that pornography, it's very possible. So every time someone clicks to consume pornography, that is fueling the demand for sex trafficking. But not only that, in many cases, as you click pornography, it's very possible that you are consuming sex trafficking.
Wow.
And you don't know it.
Yep.
Because the definition of sex trafficking, there was this act passed by a bipartisan group, and they kind of defined sex trafficking as a sexual act for money that was by either performed because of fraud, coercion, or persuasion. I'm trying to look at the exact definition here. Let me see. Oh yeah, so it's called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and it was put into place in 2000. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act, it defines sex trafficking as a situation in which a commercial act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such act has not attained 18 years of age. And so one of the key words in that definition is coercion. Yeah. If someone's coerced, if they're persuaded by force or threat, then that by definition is now sex trafficking.
Wow. Yeah.
And
so it's not somebody doesn't necessarily have to be taken from their home at age 10, across the border and all that, specifically. It could be simply there's a girl who knows a guy and he's basically saying, I've got some dirt on you, or I'm going to make this happen to you if you don't participate in this video, and, or even money could be a type of coercion, I believe, right? I mean, it could simply be.
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
Another thing that happens is if an actress or an actor shows up, because oftentimes these people who are porn producers, it's a single individual. It's not a large company anymore. So they'll show up at this person's house and says, hey, I'm going to pay you $1,000 to perform this sex act. I'm actually the one performing the sex act with you. And then they get there and it's an entirely different situation. There's no one around. And they say, hey, if you don't do this with me, then I'm going to disrupt your career. Oh, right. I'll mess with your career. I'll spread rumors. And that by definition, once again, that's coercion. It's threatening someone. And so they perform the act and then it turns into sex trafficking. And I know.
So that's good. Actually, I had some questions on that. So one of the, and you answered those, so I appreciate that. The other thing is, and this kind of gets into it, but when somebody has an addiction, a lot of times it sends them deeper and deeper into that addictive cycle. And, porn can do that as well. And I'm just thinking about, the people who started, watching, whatever kind of soft porn, and then it gets harder and more perverse as they kind of, as the time goes on. You can probably talk to this a little bit more because there's something in your brain where like the same level of oxytocin doesn't have the same effect after a period of time, right? Like once you've experienced that 100 times, or 200 times, your brain's kind of like, no, that doesn't give me the same, like, oh my gosh, this is awesome kind of feeling. And is there that sort of progression that typically happens for people who are watching porn where they just go further and further into something that's more and more perverse and, really can get themselves, into, coercive acts or child porn or any of that kind of stuff? Is that what you would say kind of?
Yeah.
That would be the natural progression?
Yeah. So to answer your question is I'm going to give you two answers. So first thing is that when it comes to this topic, people usually jump to the conclusion of, hey, I'm addicted. Yeah. And the reality is that there's a lot of progression here, like you're talking about. There's going from first time exposure, and then in some cases it's going to progress towards a habit, and then in some cases it's going to progress towards an obsession, and then in some cases it's going to progress towards compulsive behavior, and then in some cases it can go towards an addiction. It can run all the way to the course where you have a full-on addiction. So it's important to differentiate those different levels, and so that our listeners, those who are listening, they know that just because you think that you have an addiction, if you're a person who has tried multiple times to quit, then it's possible you don't have an addiction. It's possible maybe you just created a habit, or you do have this obsession that you need to deal with. But it's possible you do have a full-on addiction too, so you don't know, and everyone's different. But know that there is, because sometimes if you use that word addiction, it's a heavy word, right?
Okay, that's good.
And so oftentimes the man is going to, or the woman, whoever's, I know your audience is men's, but this pornography affects both genders. Doesn't matter the age or your religious behavior or religious background or whatever it is. So as they hear that word addiction, it's a heavy word, and so like, man, I am addicted. And oftentimes you associate that word with losing your job and losing productivity and not being able to live up to your obligations and your responsibilities. But if you can kind of use that word with some caution, because it's possible you're not addicted, it's not your job. I mean, you're not you're not supposed to diagnose unless you're there to diagnose. Anyway, so that's the first part of your question. Really and in regards to progression, here and more often, and that happens with a lot of with compulsive behavior in general, is the concept of more and more often. But one of the interesting things and the scary things about pornography is that it's not only more and more often. So like if you look at an alcoholic, the problem there is that they want more alcohol more often. More and more often of that substance. And the scary thing about pornography, and one of the things that kind of differentiates itself a part of the unique beast, is that it's more often, and in many cases it can be a more hardcore version. And so the reason why I say that gets scary is because you go from first-time exposure may be bare-chested woman in a cornfield. Like you said, in the Navy in '98, you had barely had access to the internet. You had some magazines. So you see this bare-chested woman in a cornfield, and then 18 years later, a person's looking at child pornography. And that is not to say that every person who has a challenge with pornography or who chooses to look at a pornography is going to end up enjoying the consumption of child pornography or things worse than that. But what it is saying is that there is that tendency in the brain for more and more often. And you don't have to look very far to see proof of that, because in our society today, there's a lot of people who start off. So just recently, like within the last year, that actor who is the Glee, he was an actor on the show Glee. And he was charged and convicted of possession of child pornography. And I don't remember the numbers, but I'm going to guess and say it. I think it was around 60,000 images of child pornography on his laptop. And he ended up taking his own life in prison, and after his conviction, because he couldn't deal with that. I don't know why. I'm not saying I do know why. But what I am saying is that it's very possible and it's very probable that actor didn't start off by looking at child pornography. When they were 16 or 15 or whenever they were first exposed, they weren't attracted. It's very possible and very probable that they weren't attracted to that. But then as time progressed, they fell into that more and more often and a more hardcore version downfall.
Yeah, it's really good. I mean, that's a terrible story, but it's really good information. And we do see that. I mean, I think enough of us have been, we've known of somebody, maybe hasn't been, necessarily convicted of child porn. That's not that. I mean, it should be more rare, but we definitely know people who have been in positions of prominence of some kind, and it's come out that they've had a porn addiction or they've done some, some really bad stuff. And oftentimes it is the downfall, especially of men. Some kind of act of sex that really kind of, you look at them and you just go, wow, you got all these things going on in your life that are so good and seem to be so right, and you seem to be such an upstanding person. At the same time, you've got this, this hang up, this habit, this addiction, whatever it is, that's just wrecking your life.
Right.
And so I think we should all definitely be cautious of that. So there was another piece of to fight the new drug. I don't know if you have any information on this or not, because this may not be in your wheelhouse, but that the organization does really well, and that is the promotion of this topic, and kind of making it cool almost. I mean, you guys have got T-shirts out there that look really nice, and you guys do a really good job on social media, really just kind of promoting, almost promoting the brand. And if you didn't know what it was about, you'd just go, oh, these T-shirts are cool. And then you look at it and go, oh, wait, this is sort of anti-porn or porn education kind of thing. How does that kind of piece come about? I mean, because to my knowledge, that's fairly different than what most organizations do, especially not-for-profit type of things.
Yeah. And when you say that, and actually, I just got the chills, to be honest. And I know that sound weird, but I just got the chills a little bit because that was the goal of the original founders of Fight the New Drug. There were several founders. One of the founders is still with us today. In regards to, when I say still with us, they're still active in the organization. And his name is Clay Olson. And that was their vision. When the founders started this, that was their vision, was to make it cool first and informative second. Yeah. And by you saying that, the reason why I got the chills is two-part, because they accomplished their goal, and they've held their brand, which is, in my opinion, almost impossible to do with this topic. Mm-hmm. Yep. So I'm amazed at what they've done and what they've done to achieve that. And then the second part was that I actually don't remember the second thing I was going to say. I had it in my mind, but I lost it. But that's kind of how you see the brand of Fight the New Drug. And I think that all of us at Fight the New Drug would just say, yes, that's one of our goals, is to be cool first and important second. And the reason behind that is because we're going into, the earliest we present to is 6th grade, and we're still kind of hesitant at that age. But mainly it's junior highs, high schools, and colleges. And when I tell people what I do for Fight, they're like, man, good luck, dude. Like, how are you going to maintain the attention of some 15-year-olds and not bore them to death, and get their attention and make them think and reconsider their current belief structure. Yeah. And the reason why we're able to do that is because of our presentation is very engaging and very cool. Yeah. And our whole brand. I mean, we work hard at maintaining that brand and being pure in the sense of we want to be informative and non-judgmental, and we respect your decision. If you're a person who consumes pornography, we respect that. We just ask that you kind of listen to our side as well. Yeah.
So before we close here, I did want to ask, what's the kind of response that you get from the teenagers to the sort of the early college crowd? I mean, is this new information for them? Like, is this stuff they've never heard before? And what kind of response do you get from that generation?
So we do surveys before they hear the presentation. Oftentimes we try to get them a survey to kind of gauge where their beliefs at, and then after the presentation. And more often than not, we're seeing some change of opinion. So there's going to be people who, as we walk in, no matter what the demographic is, whether it's junior high, high schools, or colleges, it's going to be some people that are totally on board. And then there's going to be people who are totally against us, and they're like pro pornography. Yeah. Right. But then there's that middle ground of like, I think it's okay, but I don't know, like, present to me your facts and your science. And so what we found is that the response is, because we present in such an engaging way and hit hard on the facts, we don't talk about any morals or this or that. It's just facts, science, and personal accounts. People are very receptive. Because the research is there to back it up.
Do you find that colleges and high schools and things are wanting you guys to come in? Like, do they recognize that this is an issue and the next generation, really needs to kind of get a handle on this, or do you guys get pushed back? I mean, do you have to really aggressively fight to get into colleges and whatnot?
Both. So we have a lot of people who. So when we go and present, once we're there and we present, they're on board and it makes sense, and the reception of the group is great. The engagement of the group is great. When I say that there's a little bit of both, is because if you haven't heard our presentation, there is a little bit of skepticism, and with good reason, because I think that if I hadn't heard the presentation, if I wasn't part of this organization and hadn't heard it, I would also be skeptical about how they're going to approach us, how we're going to approach this in an ideal way. Yeah. And so oftentimes the admins of schools will be hesitant because, man, they're addressing something where they're going to get a little bit of pushback from parents. Oh, yeah. But once we're there and the community comes in and hears us, and the students and the admins, from what I found, they're on board and they're glad that they brought us. They're glad they addressed this issue. And so to answer your question, yeah, I think that the majority are very receptive and grateful for the message.
That's great. Well, you guys are doing great work, and I've been looking forward to talking to somebody from Fight for quite a while now, and I'm glad to have the chance to talk to you, hear your story, and just some great information for the other guys who are listening as well. So, guys, if you haven't already, Garrett, give us what's the website address for Fight the New Drug?
It's fightthenewdrug.org.
Okay, fightthenewdrug.org. Okay, that's what I thought. I just want to make sure. We'll definitely have the links out there and to some of the other things that you spoke about in the show notes for this episode. And you can get to the show notes and the links, and you can find out more about Fight the New Drug by heading over to wolfandiron.com/fightthenewdrug. And that'll take you to the show notes. You'll be able to hear this episode again if you want to listen to it and share it. And Garrett, look, I just wanted to say thanks so much for being on the podcast. Like I said, great information. I know this is really going to help a lot of guys out, and I just appreciate everything that you do.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. It was a pleasure. Thanks for all you do with Wolf and Iron. It's a cool group. Thanks so much.
Well, there you have it, men. I'd love to know what you thought about the episode. Feel free to reach out to me on any of my social media networks. And look, if you got something out of this, make sure another guy does too. Share the episode and make sure it gets in front of the guys that need to hear it the most. Until next time, keep your powder dry, and may a fair wind be always in your sails.